President Trump has described the deaths of more than 60 people in a crash involving a passenger jet and a military helicopter as a real tragedy. It happened last night as a commercial flight came into land at Washington's Ronald Reagan Airport. There was an explosion as the two aircraft collided and the wreckage fell into the icy waters of the Potomac River. There were no survivors. An investigation has been launched into what happened, but the president speculated tonight that bad decisions and the policies of his political opponents were to blame. Well, our US correspondent Dan Rivers is at the scene in Washington. Dan, politics aside, it has been a dreadful day in America's capital.
It really has, yes. Reagan Airport has just reopened, but really this investigation is only just getting underway. This is the worst civil aviation disaster in a generation in the United States. The wreckage is being recovered from the Potomac River behind me, as very sadly are the bodies. In the last hour or so, we've heard from President Trump. I warn you that my report starts with footage of the moment of the impact caught on cameras around the airport.
At 8:48 last night, flight AA5342 was on final approach. From the left, you can see the lights of an Army Black Hawk on a collision course. The fireball engulfed both aircraft, killing all aboard. This is another angle from Reagan Airport, where the plane was due to land.
Both the helicopter and the plane crashed in the river.
Air traffic control confirming what they just witnessed from their tower.
I just saw a fireball and then it was just gone.
As the emergency services scrambled, it was clear the wreckage had plunged into the freezing Potomac River. Despite an extensive search and rescue operation, only bodies were found. All this playing out not far from the US Capitol and the White House, in America's most secure airspace.
This is along the route that the aircraft took on its final approach as it came into Reagan Airport. You can hear behind me the helicopters are continuing to search in this bitterly cold night, and all across the horizon now are the blue and red lights of the emergency services.
At the terminal where the flight was due, the Red Cross was assisting with supplies for the long night ahead. Among those waiting for news, James Claggett, whose son Junior was on the flight, returning from Kansas.
He was coming home. He was on a hunting trip with friends. There were several of them on the plane. I don't know, I assume that whether there's any survivors or not, or I'm just praying right now.
The grim signs of tragedy all around as the airport closed down.
The flight attendants started crying and we were told to get off the plane. We got off the plane and looked out the window, and right next to us was just hundreds of emergency vehicles. We're just very lucky. I mean, we could have been the next flight in and out of here.
Amateur pilot Chuck Fazio was on a plane coming into Reagan just before the accident.
Tonight, you know, as we were coming in, I mean, it was very gusty up there, and I was a little unsettled. I mean, I share everybody's feelings right now that this is just a horrible tragedy, and my heart goes out to those poor people and their families right now.
Today, those leading the search confirmed the family's worst fears.
Despite all those efforts, we are now at a point where we are switching from a rescue operation to a recovery operation. At this point, we don't believe there are any survivors from this accident.
Mr. President, welcome.
Thank you very much.
This evening, President Trump addressed the country from the White House briefing room.
This was a dark and excruciating night in our nation's capital and in our nation's history, and a tragedy of terrible proportions. As one nation, we grieve for every precious soul that has been taken from us so suddenly.
But after a moment of reflection, he wasted no time blaming the Democrats for pursuing diversity targets among air traffic controllers.
I put safety first. Obama, Biden, and the Democrats put policy first. I think it's very important to understand that for some jobs, and not only this, but air traffic controllers, they have to be at the highest level of genius.
The wreckage of the aircraft is just visible, lying in about 8 feet of water. A stark image of a disaster, which is already the subject of a bitter political row. Dan Rivers, ITV News, Washington.
Well, the names and nationalities of all those who died on board the American Airlines aircraft will be released later by the authorities, but we know that they included a group of figure skaters who were travelling home from the US Championships in Kansas. Among them were a World Championship winning couple from Russia. Here's our correspondent Rachel Younger.
Just 16 and full of promise. Spencer Lane posted these pictures less than 24 hours ago from the National Development Camp in Kansas. His Instagram account charting how he got there only 3 years after first taking to the ice. I met so many amazing people, he wrote, as he took this snap of the plane that should have carried him home. He couldn't believe how far he'd come, and now no one can take in that he's gone.
Spencer, in the best way possible, was a crazy kid, highly talented, like incredibly talented, has not been skating that long and just rocketing to the top of the sport.
As was his Boston teammate, Gina Han, who was also on board, both of them travelling home via Washington with their mums, sharing a journey they dreamt might end at the 2030 Olympics.
Gina, just a wonderful kid, wonderful parents, great athlete, great competitor, loved by all. These kids and their parents, they're here at our facility in Norwood 6, sometimes 7 days a week. It's a close, tight bond, and I think for all of us, we have lost family.
Spencer had just written of how much he owed the coaches accompanying them. The renowned Russian duo and former world champions, husband and wife Evgenia Shishkova and Vadim Nomov. Their son Max took an earlier plane after competing at the US Championships at the same venue.
He had no reason to stay at the National Development Camp. Both of his parents were with him while he was competing. It's well known, Mom was always too nervous to watch him skate.
Now both his parents are gone. The skating community's grief summed up by a former Olympic medalist and friend.
The coaches always stood at that entrance. The skaters just flew all over the ice, doing remarkable things, inspiring all of us.
Unforgettable teenagers who dreamt of representing America, but died in the skies above its capital. Rachel Younger, ITV News.
Well, with more now on what exactly happened and what might have gone wrong, our science correspondent Martin Stew is here. Martin.
Well, the first thing to say is that fatal accidents involving commercial aircraft in the US are extremely rare. The last one was back in 2009, and where this crash happened is one of the busiest and most protected bits of airspace. To get a sense of the geography, here we can see Ronald Reagan Airport next to the Potomac River, very close to the Pentagon, the White House and Capitol building, and there are many military flights that often move between those buildings. To the south is Fort Belvoir, where the helicopter is based. And this video, taken 6 days ago from a plane leaving Ronald Reagan, which incidentally is the busiest runway in America, shows military helicopters nearby. This next bit of video gives you an alternative view from inside a Black Hawk looking back at the airport. Now, we can see that they fly very low, and you can also see they are very close to the airport. Now, we know that the plane with 64 people on board was originally heading north for the main runway. The Black Hawk helicopter, which was on a training flight with 3 fairly experienced crew on board, was heading south on a parallel route. The plane was diverted to the smaller runway known as 33, making an S-shaped turn to its right. The helicopter doesn't appear to have been aware that that put them on a collision course. After warnings from air traffic control, the helicopter pilot eventually responded, "Aircraft in sight, request visual separation." But they may well have seen the wrong plane, because just 13 seconds later, at 8:48 p.m, the two collided. The plane was travelling 140 miles per hour at the time and was 400 feet above the water. it broke into 3 pieces and alongside the helicopter fell into the Potomac. The obvious question is, how on earth could this have happened? Aircraft are fitted with what's called TCAS, Traffic Alert and Collision Avoidance Systems, which warn the pilot and tell them about evasive action they may need to take. The trouble is, when you're at that low an altitude, the system is silenced, so there's no space, because there's no space to make manoeuvres. It's worth noting as well that in America, they have slightly different air traffic control system to the UK. And according to a retired BA captain, that gives American pilots more autonomy.
Our philosophy of controlled airspace is entirely different. In UK, all traffic in controlled airspace is under direct control of the radar controller, and there's no equivalent of the American see and avoid.
Which begs the question, could the pilot see and could they have avoided contact? Now, it was dark, but the pilot had night vision goggles, visibility was good, and the plane did have its landing lights on. The trouble is, in a well-lit city with busy airspace, lights can be confusing. And what's perhaps most damning is that there had been warnings here before. In 2013, another military helicopter came within 950 feet of the plane. And just 7 months ago, a small plane nearly collided with a commercial jet. Geraint, there is much more investigation to do, and there are many questions still to answer.
OK, Martin, many thanks. Well, let's go back to Washington. Dan, this is the first major tragedy of Trump's second presidency. What did you make of his response?
Well, look, he started trying to hit this kind of tone of respect and of unity, even having a moment of silence, but very quickly descended into divisiveness and sort of blaming the Democrats' diversity policies for effectively having substandard air traffic controllers, was what he seemed to be driving at. This has been seized on by the Democrats. Chuck Schumer, the minority leader in the Senate, gave some withering assessments of Donald Trump's press conference, saying it's one thing for internet pundits to spew off conspiracy theories, another for the President of the United States to throw out idle speculation as bodies are still being recovered and families are still being notified. It just turns your stomach, he said. David Axelrod, Barack Obama's former advisor, described the press conference as despicable. One other thing was that Donald Trump actually used a profanity when criticising the Biden administration's former transport secretary. This all coming from the podium of the briefing room inside the West Wing of the White House.
Dan Rivers in Washington, thank you very much.